Hi everyone and welcome to Women vs. Everything, our women's podcast about women's history and badass women that are still alive, where we discuss how we overcome oppression and challenges in everyday life and various paths and careers. This is Jess, my co-host.
Hello, yes, and the way this works is one of us chooses a woman from any period in history and goes and researches her story, and the other goes and researches the time period and the place and the context and all of those other things and some of the kind of themes, and then we stitch it all together on air and see what happens.
Yeah, we discuss women from all walks of life, so women of different nationalities and cultures. We're pro-sex work. We discuss women with disabilities. And we try and be as inclusive as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very important to us. And I think that the other thing that's important to acknowledge with this is that we're not choosing the people to focus on that we're choosing because we think that they were perfect or because we think that they were above any kind of critique or criticism or anything like that. We want to take a sort of positive but also critical look at this history. So us focusing on someone in this show doesn't necessarily mean that we're like glorifying them or holding them up as a perfect example or anything like that. It's all about kind of the messy parts of history as much as the nice, happy stories that you might hear more about.
I love me an anti-hero.
Yes, and for more of that, check out episode 14. Yes, Griselda Blanco, our anti-heroine episode. I loved that one. That one was great.
They're gonna make a Netflix series about her. I follow her son on Instagram.
Yeah. Are they? Oh my gosh, we have to watch it.
Yes, exactly. And I think our April Fool's Day episode about tricksters has some anti-heroes in there as well.
Yes, that is true.
Jess, I have a question for you. Do you think mainstream history podcasts that discuss mostly men, mostly white men, put in that little bit about like, oh, by the way, we're not glorifying them? What do you think?
Okay, to be fair, I don't listen to that many history podcasts because I just don't have time to listen to all the podcasts I would like to listen to. But no, to be honest, I've not really heard that now that you mention it, which is really interesting.
I was just thinking about this just as you said it, that there is it like a hyper apologism thing we do, and or is it a response to hyper levels of criticism that women who stand above the parapet and discussing women who stand above the parapet get, you know, that like, well, if you're doing it about women, they must have been fucking exceptional and we're just held to higher standards, you know?
I think that is really true. I think with any group that is a minority or is oppressed or disenfranchised or has been historically in any kind of way, I do think that those people are culturally held to higher standards often in a way that is really problematic. When actually, I've been binging that Evil Genius podcast that we talked about that you recommended to me. And I think that's one of the things I find so interesting about that. And that I was listening to one of the Bacchus episodes the other day where the host pointed out that most of the people they talk about are men, and they're trying to kind of redress the balance on that, but most of the people they focus on are men. And
because gestures at entire history of the world and all the wars and all the colonization.
But yeah, I mean, I do think that in some ways women are held to higher standards.
Yeah, I'm in a podcasting group on Facebook. It's called She Podcasts. There was a discussion recently about vocal fry. Everyone gets vocal fry, including male podcasters, but the only people who get called out on it are the women podcasters, because it's associated with this like basic bitch kind of like.
So sorry, what does that mean?
Vocal fry is like, you know, like I know when you talk like this.
Oh gosh, we do that so much.
And it's like everybody gets vocal fry. You know, it's just been lumped in with this stereotype about women being basic bitches is why. And I am a basic bitch, but who cares? I'm proud of it.
We need that on t-shirts. Add it to the merch list.
Basic and proud.
Yes, I love it. So on the subject of podcasts, have you been listening to anything interesting recently or reading or watching anything interesting?
So yeah, we were just having a chat before recording that like I just feel like this whole month of January has just been like everything is 10 paces ahead of me and I'm just scrambling to play catch up, and I'm just finding this in time, in money, in like getting shit organized and trying to like have hobbies and sort them out. It's just like Jesus Christ, I'm just failing at
Mm-hmm.
life. This week I've been primarily about the Happiness Lab with Dr. Laurie Santos, which I think I've
Okay.
recommended before. She's an absolute babe. Her whole thing is combining narrative with like scientific studies that you get to learn about psychological stuff easier and in a more interesting way. And it's all very normalizing. She especially talks about these cognitive biases that, everybody has. And they might be worse when you have depression or anxiety, but actually everybody has them. And it's not your brain failing, it's just stupid tricks our
Mm.
brain plays on us all the time. And she had a really good one called How to Feel More Empathy. And in that, they discussed reasoning when something bad happens to someone that, and they see it even with 4-year-olds. They tell 4-year-olds a story of like this kid went out and a bird pooped on him, and 4-year-olds will start trying to explain what that kid did wrong for the bird to poop on him. It's really relevant for Irish culture at the moment because we've sadly had the murder of a young woman called Aisling Murphy this week. Trigger warning. And
Yeah, I read about that. It's really awful.
it's really awful. And there has been this whole, she was only out for a run. And it's like, it's this thing again of like, well, it doesn't actually matter what she was doing. It's still, every single one of these episodes should be a tragedy, even if she's walking down a dark alley or she's doing sex work or she's just being openly trans or,
Yeah, the point is it doesn't matter. The point is that,
Exactly.
like, stop killing women no matter what they're doing.
Exactly. And I just feel pissed, because I'm so
Mm.
sick of people saying they're shocked. I'm like, if you're surprised, you haven't been listening. For every one of these tragedies that ends up in a death, there have been at least 5 or 6 every day where someone is surviving and living with trauma of assault and sexual assault, and or still living in
Yeah.
domestic violence, or still living, I just fucking hate the world sometimes, to be honest. And that's how my January's going.
Honestly, yeah. I mean, absolutely the same. As you know, I'm doing my PhD on the Me Too movement at the moment, and one of the things that's kind of struck me again and again and again as I've been researching it is just the magnitude of it.
Yeah.
It's just like the ubiquity of it almost. It's terrifying and it's enraging and it's heartbreaking and it's all of these things. And it's something that I think as a woman you don't really get to tune out of because this could be any of us. And some people would say, oh, you're being paranoid, it doesn't happen all that much. It's like, well, yeah, but it does though. It does. It happens all the goddamn time. And I don't think it's paranoia. I think it's living with a threat that is, you just have to turn on the news to see is demonstrably real.
Yeah, I've said this in another episode as well, but the book Burnout by the Nagoski twins
Oh, it's so good. So good, yes.
has an episode on burnout from living as a woman or someone who is read as a woman, because everything you just said, Jess, and the gaslighting, living with the gaslighting of everyone telling you it's not real, it's fine, you're overreacting. And it's like, actually, I think our responses are relevant to the weight of the situation we're growing up in all the time.
Right. It's a sane and rational response to a reality that we are exposed to constantly.
So that's been my week. And yeah.
Yep, I feel ya.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think you've had a much better week, unfortunately, our poor listeners. But yeah, we're being real this week. What have you been up to?
Yeah. Well, I had a bereavement in my family last week, so I've been kind of dealing with that, just kind of processing that. I'm doing okay. I've got a lot of work on at the moment, which honestly is kind of helping more than anything. I'm just kind of throwing myself at work right now, which is good because it takes me out of my head, and that is a helpful and useful thing. Yeah, I don't have much to say other than that. I guess my partner and I are being extremely COVID cautious right now because we've got a funeral to go to next week. And, honestly, if I carelessly did something that, I don't want to say that because obviously it wouldn't be my fault if I got sick, but if I went out and did something that wasn't necessary, right now. When I got sick and I couldn't go to the funeral, I would be really devastated by that. I've mostly just been hanging out at home, but that's fine. We've been doing some DIY and we've been playing some games online with friends and things, which has been good. And I've been reading a lot as well and listening to a lot of podcasts and things. Interesting you mentioned the Burnout book by the Nagoskis, because I just read another book which is called Can't Even: How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation.
Yes, I've heard of this.
It's so good. Like, I just inhaled it in like 3 days. It's quite American centric because that's the author's experience, but it is a huge amount of it translates to the UK and I'm sure to lots and lots of other places as well.
Absolutely.
And it just really kind of dissects how our generation got enormously screwed over by the financial crisis of 2008 and everything that came after, and how somehow, while being screwed over, we also managed to get this label as being lazy and entitled and all of these labels that people stick on us.
This week, it was my turn to pick the person.
Yes.
So, 1875 to 1948 were the dates this person was alive. The themes are access to education for women, giving up a career for a husband, and having a child outside of marriage. You know, this person was actually quite wealthy. So sometimes when we look up, like, what was life like for a woman in these dates, you know, this woman's experience was probably a lot cushier in a lot of respects because she was wealthy. So, today's story is about a Serbian physicist and mathematician who, despite being married to one of the most influential men of that era in those subjects, wasn't known to exist until the 1990s.
Oh, wow.
This is the story of Mileva Marić, or Mileva Marić-Einstein, Einstein's first wife.
Wow. Okay. This is someone I have never heard of. This is fascinating. Please tell me more.
So, my main source for this is this audiobook, or you can buy the reading book, called Einstein's Wife, The Real Story of Mileva Einstein Marić. And it's written by Alan Esterson, David C. Cassidy, Ruth Lewin Sime, S-I-M-E. So I came to this, I think I saw like a little news article or something pop up on my Facebook feed about myths about Mileva, and that she had in fact contributed to Einstein's theory of relativity and was an unnamed co-author, or at the very least researcher of that topic, because they met in university. So I'm really glad I downloaded this book, because even researching this, I was going to look at other sources, but lots of them worked off things that are now proven to be hearsay. So this book is so well researched. In 1986, their son Hans Albert published the correspondence that this couple had, and they used that as a point of research. And those letters were mostly dated between 1899 and 1903, when they would be apart during their university holidays. 43 of those letters were from Albert to Mileva, and only 10 of hers to Albert have survived. Mileva also had a best friend, Helena, who we'll talk about in a minute, and she wrote to her from 1899 to 1932, and one of her descendants also published correspondence. And that was when more became known about Mileva's existence. So there was a myth that she did contribute significantly to his work, especially his famous theory of relativity. This actually story reminds me a lot of the Growing of Whale story, where I went in expecting one thing, like this, fearsome pirate queen, and it's like, actually she was just a self-serving woman who kind of sold out to whatever gave her opportunity, including the English, which I'm very upset about. So Mileva's story, I was like expecting this, like, you know, she's the unsung hero of physics and maths. And in reality, it's a very personal story about a woman before her time who overcame adversity but ended up without the career or the marriage she deserved or wanted. So a lot of those myths about her contributions were due to like hearsay, poor research, and mistranslations as well sometimes, you know. So this book goes
Yeah.
through that as well, how they came to the conclusions that they did. So I'm kind of synopsizing the first 2 chapters of this book for you, which sounds like lazy research, but it's actually been a lot, because my computer is broken. So I hand dictated from an audiobook, which I really don't want to do again.
That's dedication to the podcasting cause.
I was just so taken by her story.
Yeah.
Her mom was from a wealthy family and her dad was from a peasant family, but then through the army rose ranks and got educated. So they lived first in Titel, which is in Serbia, what is now kind of Austria-Hungary. So she actually was disabled. She walked with a limp, which was actually written out of a lot of articles, is that I don't think people realize, she's also a pioneer for people with disabilities. She had a congenital dislocation of the hip when she was born, which now is fixed so easily, but back then it was you just gotta live with it. So there was even a letter home from one of her housemates in one of the places she was staying, and this housemate described Mileva in the letter was just so unkind how she described her physically. The biases against people with disabilities was huge,
Yeah.
Secondary education, this poor woman, she moved around a lot for her education. So her dad was told in her primary education that she was quite bright and she was a bit of a phenomenon. So he was really committed to her getting whatever education he could access for her. So she was Serbian but also fluent in German. In 1886, she entered a high school for girls, followed by a grammar school. And in 1891, her dad had to get special permission to enroll her as a private student at an all-male university in Zagreb. And the special permission had to come from the Minister of Education.
Wow.
Yeah. She had to be away from her family from the age of 14 onwards, even in a different country, in order to access education that she couldn't source locally. So that's already so much adversity. But she always passed her entrance exams. She again had to get special permission to attend physics lectures. And it's really interesting. So she attended the lectures and took exams in physics while they were awaiting the special permission from the Minister of Education. And her scores before the special permission came through were really low in physics. And after it came through, her exam scores increased. So it's suggestive of a bias on the part of the teachers, physics especially, and maths.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're still seen as very masculine courses today. So back then it was a little bit who do you think you are to even attend the lectures? And obviously back then we had a lot fewer protections in terms of teaching and marks given, and everything was very subjective and unregulated.
Right, so it would have been really easy for the teachers to let their bias show through in that way and be reflected in the grades that she was getting.
Yeah, even a conscious bias. I imagine she was openly told, you shouldn't be here. In 1894, she passed her exam finals with high marks, and her highest marks were in maths and physics. Around this time, she fell ill and her grades lowered, and she then moved to Switzerland to attend the girls' high school in Zurich for 1 semester. And throughout her school history, there's reports that she was really badly bullied, So also the frequent school moves to just get her access, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. As a woman and as a disabled woman as well, in such a patriarchal world and such a male-dominated field.
Yes, exactly. So in 1896, she joined the Zurich Polytechnic. Zurich would be her main choice as someone who's fluent in German. It was kind of where, you specialized in French or German and you chose where to go for university after that. That polytechnic had been accepting women since the 1870s. She passed the maths entrance exam and she was studying physics and maths and astronomy. So she enrolled for a diploma course to teach physics and maths at a secondary school level. In that course, there was 6 students and she was the only woman. And she was also only the 5th woman to ever enter that section.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, even though the school had been accepting women since the 1870s. So 26 years.
So what year was it that she went to this university?
1896. So in 26 years, there was only 5 women studying maths and physics.
Wow.
And it's here that she met Albert Einstein. and they became close friends and study buddies. She was nearly 21, whereas he was about 17 and a half, which just shows how much more quicker and direct his path to university was compared to hers.
Right, absolutely. I'm assuming, I mean, I don't know a huge amount about his story from his early life, but I'm assuming that he didn't have to fight for access to that every step of the way like she did.
Didn't have to move schools to get, oh, I need this bit to be able to study at the Polytechnic, so I need to go to Switzerland to learn that, and I need to go to this country to learn that, and I'm being bullied, so now it's just huge. So Zurich Polytechnic was very popular with forward-thinking people because they kind of liked Switzerland's sense of democracy, and both schools in Zurich were open to learning from men and women. So it was very attractive for people that were kind of forward-thinking of that time.
Yeah, so this was really interesting. I think often when we think of Switzerland, I think as a country, it has this reputation for being very progressive, very sort of forward-thinking and all of those things. And kinda, I guess, in some ways, but also, fun fact, women didn't get the vote in Switzerland until 1971.
What?
Yeah, seriously. It was the last Western Republic to grant women the right to vote.
What the fuck?
So Switzerland it's divided into these cantons, which I guess are kind of states. They're described as member states of Switzerland. They all sort of have their own governance to a certain extent. It's a little bit like the states in the USA, I guess. So some of the cantons approved women's suffrage as early as 1959. The last holdout didn't do it until 1990.
Oh my god.
Right. That's the year I was born. After that point, women sort of started to gain power in the political realm. The first woman on the Federal Council, which has 7 members, was Elizabeth Kopp, who served starting from 1984. And the country had its first female president in 1999, and that was Ruth Dreyfus.
Wow, so when it did progress, it progressed quickly.
Yeah, so kind of around the turn of the 19th century, Switzerland was moving very much towards becoming an industrialised nation. At the time, it had the second largest cotton industry after England. And in the first half of the 19th century, there was lots and lots of kind of progress being made. So the road networks were expanding, the railway networks were expanding. All of these different kind of industries were booming. And there was a lot of jobs in factories, a lot of which were taken by women. In pre-war Switzerland, sort of the late 1930s, women accounted for about 40% of factory workers. And many other women were employed in industries like domestic service, retail, farming, tourism. And because Switzerland was sort of relatively protected from what was going on during World War One, the gender differences were slightly different to how they operated in different countries, although, there was still a lot of sort of gender-specific discrimination, pay gaps and things. Women's jobs and positions were generally more precarious. This is sort of what we're building up to, and this is sort of the kind of society that she'd have been coming into, this kind of pre-World War One, proto-industrialised nation. And at the time, as many places were, Switzerland was fundamentally a very patriarchal society, so women were expected to be subservient to the authority of their fathers, and then later, obviously, once they're married, to their husbands. And some of the sources I read say that actually it's still sort of a bit like that. A lot less overt, obviously, and women have a lot more rights. On paper, it's sort of equal, but actually, apparently, there is still this real sense of these very strong gender roles where women are still expected to kind of stay at home, raise children, do most of the domestic work now, just as much as they were 100, 120 years ago. I read one article where a woman just describes that she was, this was a recent article from the last few years, where a woman describes being, quote, shoved aside at work when she got pregnant, and then was told not to come back when her maternity leave was over. So going back to sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, when this story was taking place, so there was an important milestone for women's suffrage in early 1887, where this woman called Meta von Salis, who was a female historian and a suffragette, wrote an article demanding suffrage for women. The article sadly got quite a negative reaction. People didn't like what she had to say. But her argument was very straightforward. Her argument was, women pay taxes just like men, therefore women should have the right to vote just like men. But for many people at the time, the role of women was very much understood to be wives and mothers, not to be participants in the political realm. So there was this almost kind of presumed incompetence. They were perceived to be lacking the moral and intellectual qualifications to make political decisions.
Jesus.
Yeah, so in other words, her argument was the only justification for this inequality is the gender factor, because women are working and women are paying taxes and all of these things. Obviously didn't really work, didn't really get much traction at the time, unfortunately, but that was, so it was a very, very long fight for those basic rights of, even being able to vote.
We'll have to cover her in a future episode, and also if you're a feminist living in Switzerland today, come on our show and tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I read this 2019 article by a woman called Alexandra Dufresne, who moved to Switzerland, I think from the US, if I remember correctly. And she said, to the outside world, Switzerland projects a modern image, excellent public transportation, cutting-edge scientific research, high-quality news media, extraordinary affluence, and a well-employed and multilingual population. Like so many newcomers, I was caught off guard by the extent of the sexism. Which I didn't expect at all. I did not expect that at all. I very much had the impression that it's this very, very progressive country, and I think maybe it's a little more complicated than that.
So there's still this issue of gender inequality in Switzerland today, and this is 126 years ago. Jesus.
First of all, what a badass.
Right?
But yeah, it must have been really difficult.
It must have been so hard. Yeah. So she and Albert were both on this academic track, which was essentially to get the equivalent to what's now a master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it required 14 years of prior schooling, a junior year in college, doing some collaborative subjects and electives, intermediate exams, and then 4 years to do final diploma exams, a research thesis, and an oral exam. And then they could get what was called a habilitation, which would enable them to teach at a university level. And to get that, you would have to submit quality research publication and an oral examination conducted by the entire faculty. And they both kind of had their sights set on that as well.
Wow, academia is complicated.
Oh,
I guess that's something that doesn't change.
No, that really doesn't change. And some of the things that we're talking about in academia in this story, Jess, you might be able to comment on better than me. I imagine they're still fucking true to this day, to be honest.
It's still brutal.
Mm-hmm. So they both got good grades, but not like remarkably amazing grades compared to their peers in the first year. They spoke often and they went on like a hike together. We can see from their letters they reference that. And then Mileva went to Heidelberg in Germany. She got a job as a registered auditor and attended some maths and physics lectures in the local university there as like a sabbatical, not a sabbatical, but like an exchange kind of thing. So she was just there for one semester, and it was during that time their famous correspondence started. And Albert initiated, and at the start they're both using like the formal pronouns and greetings, but he initiated with like a 4-page letter. So he's mad about her. Normal stuff at the start. They just caught up on their life and their studies. They did reference studying together a lot. Albert would say he enjoyed studying with her and he was excited to study with her in the future. So there's a lot of evidence of them being study buddies. In 1898, Albert wrote to her and he was talking about the death of a mutual friend. And he says, if you don't mind, I'd like to come over this evening and read with you. So like as a comfort after the mutual friend passed. So increasingly we're seeing this like nice intimacy growing. And that they're meeting each other on a friendship level and an intellectual level at this point. In 1889, for hours I sat next to you, my darling table partner. It was then revealed to me in harsh tints how closely knit our psychic and psychological lives are. In 1899, they started using less formal language, and he gave her a nickname, which was the German word for Dolly. And yeah, he also references reading Helmholtz and being sad that he's not reading it with her. So there's a lot of value he puts on her as a study buddy. He said, I find it soothing and less boring. So in their third year of the Polytechnic...
That's quite sweet.
I know, it's really sweet. It's like, it's
sweet.
Very loving at this point. And at this point, we're not sure... It still seems like it's friendship, but a bit of dancing towards becoming more... So in their third year at the Polytechnic, Albert became even more engrossed in theoretical physics and doing his private readings. And He wrote to her a lot about these theories and his early thoughts and ideas that would later become his famous papers. And Mileva's replies that have survived, they don't respond. So it's very unlikely from what we can see that she was part of the formulation of these ideas, but she wrote that she enjoyed reading about them, you know? And it's in this year that she met Helene Kaufler-Savick, who would be her lifelong friend and confidant. And it was his grandson that published their correspondence. So the evidence we have for this book has been her writing to her best friend and the writing to Albert. So when it came to time to do their final diploma and exams and their research, Albert mentioned an idea for a thesis that would be later related to his famous theory of relativity, but he kind of acknowledges like, oh, you've enough to focus on, Mileva, without hearing about my hobby horse, you know? So it's again, like he's just using her, he's using her as a sounding board, you know, as opposed to...
Yeah, he's obviously got a deep respect for her on an intellectual level.
Yeah, and there's this real sense that, yeah, she just loved hearing about it and didn't necessarily respond. But in his letters, there's a surviving passage, which is clearly, since you enjoy hearing about it so much, and he goes into more detail, you know, so there is obviously this sense of like interest. So they did propose a 2-part project on heat production that they would work on together, and they devised that and researched it together. At this point, they were both also offered assistantships positions at the Polytechnic, but there's a quote from a friend of Mileva writing to her mother who says, oh, Mileva's been offered this, but she says because of the students she's unlikely to accept and might apply for an open position for like a librarian. There's no other evidence to explain what because of the students means. It's possible discrimination. It's possible she was just like, I hate third level students and don't want to teach them. You know, it's possible anything, you know, or maybe the students might have discouraged her, saying like, oh, we think you'd be better at this career path. We don't know. Yeah. So unfortunately in 1900, Mileva didn't attain her diploma. We can't say for definite there was a bias against her. But at the time there was no minimum passing grade or performance on record. So without clear boundaries of expectations, like below this grade is a fail, they still decided that she had failed. So she decided to take those exams again in the next year and also work on her doctoral in the meantime. And at this point, Albert writes her, I'm so lucky to have found you, a creature as strong and independent as I am. I feel alone with everyone else except you.
Aww.
Yeah. At this point, she also gives him a nickname, Johnny. So it's Johnny and Dolly. This is the point where the sparks fly. So we have a letter from her at this stage where she's failed her final exams. My dear Johnny, because I like you so much and because I can't give you a little kiss, I am writing you this letter to ask if you like me as much as I do you. Answer me immediately, 1,000 kisses from your Dolly. It's just so cute. It's so cute.
That's so sweet. But also props to her for just putting her cards on the table and being like, I'm into you, are you into me?
Right? I mean, oh my goodness, that beats Tinder any day anyway. The feeling was reciprocated, you know. So at this point as well, Einstein starts to explicitly mention Mileva's role in his research. There's 13 instances in letters dated September 1900 to 1901 where he discusses it as a collaborative effort. So, for example, he says, if a law of nature emerges from this, we will send it to Wiedemann's Annalen, which was a journal. How happy and proud I will be when the two of us together will have brought our work on the relative motion to a victorious conclusion. And there's twice where he mentions our theory of molecular forces. One of the authors of the book, Walker, he did conclude that it seems like she was a co-author and her name deserved to have appeared on the original 1905 relativity papers. And multiple authors agree. And they also say that there's other papers he published in 1905 that her name should have appeared on. Yeah, like this is a man who loves her and he's like delighted with his life with the two of them as scientific equals, you know? So I think as we go on, we'll see maybe what happened, that she didn't get named as a co-author. But anyway, all the research
Yeah.
kind of says she's not really a co-author of the relativity papers 4 years later, which are the famous ones. Einstein actually wrote with a friend, Nicolo Bezzo, who's coming up, and he acknowledged him for supports, practical and emotional. Whether Mileva provided other supports around those papers, like practical or emotional, it can't really be proven. 1901, Albert submitted himself as a sole author for his first paper for publication, which appeared in the Wiedemanns Annals of Physics, March of that year. And the title is Conclusions Drawn from the Phenomenon of Capillarity. 1 month later, he wrote to Mileva saying that he met a famous lecturer and said he is very interested in our investigations.
That hour is doing a lot of work in that sentence.
Exactly. So I'm like, is it just he loves this woman and he loves these sides of her? Is it just their paper probably wasn't going to get published if her name was on it, so they made a mutual agreement to not put her name on it? Is it his ego won, but then she stays with him and they seem very happy for a long time afterwards? I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe she's gaslighted so much into thinking her contributions don't matter. It was just another so-called normal event,
Yeah.
So he also wrote, when we come to Zurich, we will seek to get empirical evidence on this capillarity thing. And he's like, we will send it to, and again, mentioning that journal. So again, ours, there's a lot going on.
That's very heavily implying a co-project, a co-authorship, isn't it?
Exactly. But at the same time, when Mileva wrote to Helena, she named Einstein as the sole author of the research. So at this point anyway, they're in their final years, and it's very normal for students to marry in their final year of university or start making plans to. So Mileva's friend Helena moved away for marriage at this point, and her other best friend sadly died of TB, which I'm just
that's sad.
Yeah, that must be a shit time. So Einstein informed his family of his intention to marry Mileva, and this is, I guess, people didn't have the emotional intelligence that we have today, but his family really disapproved of Mileva, and instead of kind of protecting her from that, he wrote her letters saying everything they said about her.
Oh, no. What? No. Why would you?
I know.
No.
Why, dude?
No.
He wrote her a letter while he was on holidays back visiting his family. He's like, I'm going to marry Mileva. She's awesome. He wrote a letter describing how his mother was just completely hysterical about it. She really opposed Mileva's age. So, by the time you're 30, she'll be an old witch, is one quote.
Wasn't the age gap 4 years?
Yeah, but I think maybe the plan was he would get engaged to some 18 to 20-year-old, when he finishes university. There was also a lot about her disability. No decent family will have her. You're ruining your future and your opportunities. Like you, she's a book, but you need to have a wife. This is all stuff he wrote, Mileva, that his mother said.
Wow.
And he said, they think you aren't healthy, which again infers that it's her disability is the problem more than anything. Einstein was from Jewish heritage, but they were non-practicing Jews, so it seems unlikely that was a major issue. But he says, no matter what happens, we'll have the most wonderful life in the world. And as part of that paragraph, he mentions filled with pleasant work. So there's, again, this thing of I don't know, I'm nearly imagining their desks next to each other working away on their little on their little science, One thing Albert did agree with was his dad had this quite old-fashioned view that you have to have full-time work before marrying, and we'll see that Albert kind of stuck to that one. It would be 2 years later when Albert's dad died, he gave him a blessing on his deathbed.
Oh, wow.
Well,
so he kind of came around in the end, but very late.
They still didn't, and his mother was alive for quite a while after that and was still a bitch, so yeah. Sorry, it's just funny calling someone from that long ago a bitch. Yeah, and again, we've more indications that Mileva was a co-author. You know, he says, I look forward to resuming our new common work. You must now continue with your research. How proud I'll be to have a doctor for a spouse when I'll only be an ordinary man. Which I think that's really cute.
That is really sweet. And again, like it really sounds like he was not threatened by her. Yeah, he didn't
No.
have these ideas that she couldn't be as smart as he was because she was a woman or something. Like it really sounds like it was this very equal partnership based on like deep compatibility.
Yeah, they both relished in each other's achievements and goals and plans, and like I said, seemed to share this vision of the future that they would, yeah, work together forever. In their physics and maths department, the head lecturer was this guy, Weber, and he had some conflict with Albert to the point where Albert actually left that Zurich Polytechnic and went elsewhere. You know, Albert was known to have like a difficult personality and then was already facing a lot of anti-Semitism being Jewish. Like it probably wouldn't take much of a difficult personality for someone to be like, all right, get out, you know. That left Mileva still working under Weber for her research doctorate, which must have been very awkward. And in her letters, they mention Weber's critical comments about her work and arguments she has with Weber about the quality of her work, you know, and it's also to Helena. She mentions this as well. Her thesis, as I said already, for her diploma had a low score, and she wanted to expand on that topic for her doctorate. Whereas Weber was just like, nah, your thesis didn't get good marks, you shouldn't expand on it. Now Weber has this conflict with Albert. She's just on a losing side altogether. That's up for debate because the university had previous female students and there was no previous reports of difficulties like that with Weber, but we all know most of these ones don't get reported. And Albert at this time was struggling to get a job, and he was convinced that it was this Weber guy sabotaging him through letters of poor recommendation. So there's this ongoing conflict between like her beau, the guy who's overseeing her fucking research project. Like, could you imagine being like, Jess, you were doing a PhD. Could you imagine that you being in that position?
It's untenable. Like, you need that support. You know, when I'd started kind of applying for my PhD and starting my PhD, like, I think if I'd had people going, this project doesn't have legs, this isn't good enough or whatever, I honestly don't think I'd have got very far. I wouldn't have. You have to really, really deeply believe in something to push through that when there's people in that position of power telling you it's not going to work.
They're not just telling you it's not going to work, but you know that they hate your closest friend. You know, that's also colouring it. And you also know by just having the body that you have, you're unwelcome in their space. I'm just like, she must have been so resilient, but we'll find out later she actually does really suffer with a lot of chronic illnesses and stuff, and I think it just must have been burnout from all this. At this point, Albert went to Italy looking for work because he just found there was so much anti-Semitism in the German-speaking countries. Then on top of that, she just got another wave of onslaught from Albert's parents.
Ugh.
Yeah, her mood really, really deteriorated in this time, and it kind of started this like first of many melancholies that would plague her throughout her life.
I guess what we now might conceptualize as depression.
Yeah.
Or as you said, burnout.
Yeah, but don't worry, it gets worse, because in 1901 she finds out she's pregnant.
Right. And they are not yet married at this point.
They're not married. He's in a different country. She's working with his...
Not ideal.
She's working with her PhD tutor who fucking hates him. Albert at this point had some like private tutoring and a job at a patent office. And both those jobs would be at risk if it was found out he was part of this like pregnancy before marriage. So he was in a place called Winterthur. So in their letters at this, the solution they came up with, well, that he came up with really, is that maybe she couldn't at all come to Winterthur and instead stay in Zurich, and he visited her on Sundays because they were just so worried about being found out and he would lose his job.
I guess there was so much stigma about that back then, even though it wasn't that unusual. I found one source from 1913 that offered some kind of stats around children born outside of marriage, and it indicated that so as of 1910, so just a little bit after this, just over 4% of children were born outside of marriage in Switzerland. And in Germany it was about 9%.
God.
So like it wasn't that unusual, but it was massively stigmatized. So I can see why that would have been a a very challenging thing for them both to deal with.
And that's how shame works, is it takes something that everyone is going through and tells you you're the only one, and it's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, his job in Winterthur was a temporary contract. So after that, he got a job in Schaffhausen, which was again part-time, and she moved to a nearby town to that. And again, they only saw each other on Sundays. So in his letters, Albert's like, I'll take any job and I'll just marry you immediately and we can get married in secret and da-da-da. But Mileva has to do her diploma exams while she's pregnant. So the repeat exams that she failed.
Mm-hmm.
Around that time, Albert basically disappeared. He moved house and then went on holidays with his bitch mother in the Alps. And at that time, it's all through post. So if you don't know where someone is, there's no contact.
Mm-hmm.
So Mileva was basically alone sitting her repeat exams.
So I'm sorry. I was starting to think this guy was quite a good partner, but then he ditched his pregnant partner to go off to the Alps with his mother who hated her while she was also sitting her exams.
This is where we see a real change and where we see direct evidence of like what Albert says, you know, because he's saying he loves her, he's going to marry her, not matching up to how he behaves. So I don't know if it's the way he was always a shit partner and there just wasn't really evidence for that, or and now that she's pregnant and needs support, he's like, I don't do support, or you know, if this pregnancy brought about something in him that made him check out.
I know you can't hear eye rolls on the podcast, but I'm eye rolling for days right now.
Well, you're going to sprain your eyeballs with the content that's coming up, because unfortunately this gets much sadder. There is no indication at this point that either of them had told their parents or they told Weber. And sadly, but maybe not surprisingly considering the stress she's under, like Mileva's thesis grade was poor and her subject exams were poor. So the committee recommended again that she wasn't granted this diploma and therefore she couldn't get a teaching job. Again, she's already got this fucking problematic relationship with the Weber guy. There's no one else she can do a repeat exam or continue her doctorate under. We see that this is kind of the end of her career ambitions.
That's so sad.
So she's facing the prospect of returning to her parents, who by now lived in Switzerland as well, having failed her exams, being unmarried and pregnant. And she writes Albert asking him to come with her and he declines. So she begs him to at least write a letter to her father stating his plans to marry her. And there's no evidence of such a letter. And Albert, for whatever reason, actually doesn't go and see her family at all until 4 years later. So she returned to her parents' house for the birth. And waiting for her at her parents' house while she's ready to drop with a baby is a letter that Albert's parents, but mostly his mother, sent to her parents, just being completely vile. Her own parents were thankfully really supportive, because I don't know how this poor woman is doing it. Albert at this time is really digging his heels in about like, no, I need to have a full-time job and then I'm totally going to marry you. But their letters are still really positive and affectionate. So I don't know if it's such a thing that like standards were so low for unmarried women who were pregnant at that time that just the fact he wasn't ditching her was like amazing. But her letters to him at this time are still really affectionate and loving, and vice versa. They name the bump Liesel, a girl's name, and Albert describes being dizzy with joy. He's moving around for a job again. He said, I'll marry you once I've been there for 2 months without telling anyone. And, quote, we'll be students as long as we live. When you are my dear little wife, we'll diligently work on science together so we don't become old Philistines. So there's not a difference in tone in his letters, but it's from her that we see there's a difference in need that's not being acknowledged, and maybe he's too dense to fucking see it. I don't know.
She's the one who's going to bear the brunt of that stigma of being unmarried and having a child.
Yeah.
And so maybe the urgency isn't there for him, and he's, I don't know, too like self-absorbed or clueless or something I mean, being generous, we could say too clueless to realize that, but maybe he also just doesn't care all that much because it's not impacting him in a less charitable reading of the situation.
Exactly, yeah. But throughout the pregnancy, they talk about keeping the child, and in February 1902, she gives birth to a daughter, and the plan is still to keep the child, but they kind of don't know what to do. He's like, I need full-time work. So there's a letter where he just says, ask your papa what we should do. He's an experienced man. And it seems somewhere along here, after this correspondence, they changed their mind about keeping the little girl. And sadly, the little girl's details are lost to history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So we don't know anything about who her or what happened to her or who she was or anything.
No, in 1902 to 1903, there's a gap in the letters between the couple. And in 1901 to 1903, and then 1904 again, there's a gap between her letters to her friend Helena, who knew about the pregnancy. You know, there is questions whether there was maybe like an intentional burning of the letters at the time or afterwards when they were found by the descendants. But little Lisa, her existence wasn't known until 1986. And despite extensive searches, no one can find any trace of her. There's no registered name. Mr. Marić, Mileva's dad, had legal connections. So it could be that it was just, you know, he knew what to do. 5 months after the birth, Mileva came back again to Switzerland alone. Mileva's father wrote to Albert saying the birth was really difficult. And yeah, Mileva was too sick to write the letter herself. So her dad had to. And Albert didn't visit. He never met this daughter. And again, he moved to an apartment in Bern for a patent job and kind of left them in the lurch, basically, unable to get in touch with him for a bit.
Oh, wow.
In June 16th, 1902, Albert finally gets his full-time job as a patent clerk. 6 months later, Mileva was still holding out for this marriage that was promised. Yeah, at this point, it is fair to speculate like he had reservations maybe about marrying or the relationship, but was just in too deep. They married in January of 1903 with no family from either side there, and the only witnesses were two of Albert's new friends in Bern.
I mean, finally, right?
Oh my God.
Wow.
Doing the bare minimum super late. 8 months later, Mileva returned home for 1 month to settle on the daughter Lieserl's future. And what she came home to find out that Lieserl had actually contracted scarlet fever. So it's possible that she died, you know. There was local hearsay saying that she was baptized locally and died. There was hearsay that maybe she was sent to Mileva's friend Helena, that Helena's second daughter was actually her, but the dates don't add up. She was disabled by scarlet fever and lived in a convent, you know. And back then it was normal for a child adopted away to never be mentioned again. And years later, after Mileva had 2 sons, she did write to Helena about my unfulfilled desire for a daughter. And again, this was another trigger for depression, and Mileva became more reliant on Albert after this point.
So it's possible that Lieserl died, but it's also possible that she was given away for adoption.
Yeah, we just don't know.
Wow.
There's no mourning, there's nothing, you just carry on with your life, you know, was the norm.
Yeah.
So she's emotionally fragile, she doesn't have a career, and she's married this man who's dicked her around a lot. So it just must have been a shit time. So 2 weeks after their marriage, Albert wrote a letter saying, I am now a married husband and lead with my wife a nice, comfortable life. She takes excellent care of everything, cooks well, and is always cheerful. In the same month, Mileva wrote to Helena and said, we have a nice little household which I am taking care of quite alone. So you can imagine that, at least in the beginning, until I got used to it, I did not have much leisure time. So that's the same month they both wrote that, and you can see the differences again in their perspective.
Yeah, the contrast there is really striking, and the difference between, she's obviously had this incredibly promising career that she's functionally given up, or been forced to put aside, and now she's essentially a housewife, which I mean, okay, if that's someone's choice, great, I respect that, but it really doesn't sound like it was. It really doesn't sound like it was something that she wanted or something that made her happy.
Not at all. And in 1903, she wrote, I am now even closer to my sweetheart, if it is at all possible, than I was in our Zurich days. I am often angry at the boring office that takes away so much of his time. So at this point, Albert was working in an office 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, also doing some private tutoring, and also doing his own academic work, trying to get published, and searching for an academic job. Can you imagine as well? So, like, she's in this new city, and okay, it's like, all right, you try and make friends. So then she's trying to make friends with, like, I don't know, the wives of his colleagues or whatever. But she is literally not like other girls, you know. She's disabled, she's educated, she's had this huge life experience she can't talk about, having a child and giving it up for adoption. I just can't see her relating to other women in a meaningful way. And, you know, with the confines of the time, it's just like, how would you sit down and have a real conversation, a real, truthful, authentic conversation with anyone when it seems like at the time that wasn't even normal for her to do with her husband, you know, which is why they've such different... Right. So I'm like, God, it must have been so isolating. And at this time, anyway, Einstein's publishing papers that were the backdrops to his famous 1905 research. Like, this is kind of adding to what I was saying about the isolation. In Bern, they had friends that had regular discussion groups called, and they nicknamed themselves the Olympia Academy. And Mileva would have qualified to attend that, you know, because it was for scientists and mathematicians to go and discuss things. One of the guys in this group wrote, you know, Mileva seldomly attended, and when she did, she, quote, listened attentively, but never intervened in our discussions. So again, she's probably the only woman in this group.
Yeah.
And it's like, am I being invited for myself, or am I just tagging along because I'm Albert's wife? And I can imagine as well, like, so much of his passion for her was about their intellectual connection. And it's like, that's different now. Is it that their whole relationship was propped up by, that's how much that's what caused him to fancy her so much, you know? And now it's just different, and she can't access it in the same way as before. And
yeah. Do you want to know a little bit about what was going on in women's rights in Germany at this time?
Yeah, go on.
It was an interesting time. So during this period from kind of about 1890 up until about the end of the First World War in 1918, there was this big growth of organisations that were promoting women's rights in various ways. So there was something called the, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation here and I'm sorry, but there's something called the Bund Deutscher Frauenverein, which approximately translates to the Union of German Feminist Organisations. And that was kind of an umbrella organisation that mostly was dealing with the concerns of middle-class women, whereas working-class women were more working alongside the socialist movement for their kind of issues and rights and things. It was quite divided along class lines at the time. Yeah, so there was this movement ongoing for women's suffrage at the time that really had the most of its momentum from about 1911 until 1919, when it disbanded because women's suffrage was achieved in November of that year. So, you know, relatively early compared to many other countries in Europe at the time. As kind of Germany's industrial economy was growing, particularly kind of in the lead up to the First World War, but really from about the 1890s, more and more women were coming into the workforce at that time in various kind of different ways. And from kind of the 1870s onwards, formal education for girls in the middle and upper classes had been normalised, although usually girls would leave formal education at the point that they had their first period, which typically in that time was around the ages of 15 or 16.
Jesus. What, so you don't get blood on the education? That
makes really no weird, sense. Isn't it?
That makes no sense.
It's very strange.
Who's going around checking the period police? Like, what the fuck?
It's very... Right, it's so weird. So after that point, she might continue being educated at home with tutors, might continue attending occasional lectures and things. For lower class girls' education, formal education was not really normalised. They'd learn farming tasks and housekeeping tasks and things from their parents. Middle and upper class women were also really pushing for access to higher education, which I think very much ties in with the kind of themes of this story that we're dealing with. So there was a woman called Anita Augsburg, who was the first female university graduate in Germany. And there were several other German women who weren't able to gain admittance to German universities, and so they went to Zurich to be educated there.
Go Zurich!
More German universities started allowing women to enroll from about 1909, but a lot of women were graduating and finding that they were unable to actually practice the professions that they'd qualified into. Lawyers, for example, were barred from private practice and from public administrative posts. There was a women's legal aid agency which was established in 1894 by a woman called Mary Stritt, and by 1914 there were 97 similar organisations, many of which employed female law graduates. From kind of 1918 through to the 1930s, there was something called the Weimar Constitution, which enacted equality of education between the sexes, and various other things, including equal opportunity in civil service jobs, equal pay in the professions, lots and lots of different sort of things. And that actually put Germany quite far ahead of many other countries at that time in terms of women's legal rights. So Czechoslovakia, Iceland, Lithuania, and the Soviet Union also didn't have any distinction between the sexes in the professions at that time, whereas countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Norway still had quite heavy restrictions on which professions women could go into and in what capacity. By the 1920s, there were 32 women in the Reichstag, which is the lower house of the legislature in Germany, which amounts to 6.7%, which was significantly higher than 2.1% in the British House of Commons and 1.1% in the US House of Representatives. Far ahead of other countries in some ways. So this group of German women's organisations that I mentioned earlier was really the dominant kind of force in feminism in Germany at the time. It had around 300,000 members by the time World War I started.
Nice.
And that grew to over 900,000 in the 1920s. And there were lots of other kind of groups organising at the time as well. So there were particularly kind of feminist groups organised around faith. So there would be like Catholic women's groups, Protestant, Jewish women's groups, and so on. So in the end, this organisation included 137 different women's rights groups until eventually the Nazi regime disbanded it in 1933.
Oh, fucking Nazis. They ruin everything.
Yup. So this period when Mileva was living in Germany would have been, it was really sort of a time when lots of pushes for women's rights were happening. And again, I don't know whether she had any involvement in any of that directly, but it would have had an impact on the kind of wider culture at the time, I'm sure, and particularly as a woman in a male-dominated environment.
I feel really sad for her, because I think like wealthy women are the ones we end up reading about in history because they had the means to make history,
Yeah.
And very rarely, therefore, have they been involved in the feminist movement of the time because they're off doing their own pioneering thing because they've all the means. And I'm like, I just really feel like at this point Mileva could have done with like a friend. And like, I wish she could have just met these women and it might have changed so much for her,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, quite often I'm like, I can see how they wouldn't have been bothered to join the feminist groups but with Mileva, I feel like just for the social aspect and a sense of belonging, I really wish she could have accessed these people,
Yeah.
With her, even though she didn't pass her diploma, she could have still, from the 4 years of physics work she'd done, been a university librarian or a tutor, or she could have started taking more courses towards another career. And she didn't, and we don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe she was just burnt out, from so much rejection and shame. So in August of that year, 1905, this is probably something as well that prevented her from doing that. The trip to see Lise Earle, where she found Lise Earle had scarlet fever, she discovered she was pregnant, and she gave birth to Hans Albert, who they called Little Albert. At this point, her letters kind of go back to the before times. There was like Little Albert seemed to bring them closer for a while. So her letters to Helena, say like, Albert's been making toys. She expressed pride and joy in her husband's achievements. And this is while they're heading into what's called the miracle year for Albert, 1905. So yeah, the year of miracles. So Hans Albert's first birthday approached, and a flurry of Einstein's now famous papers arrived monthly at the Annales Physique and one at the University of Zurich. And those included a paper on the paper on quantum hypothesis. And these are monthly, his second doctoral dissertation to the university, his paper conclusively supporting atomic hypothesis in an explanation of so-called Brownian motion. I mean, this means nothing to me.
Do we have a female physicist who wants to come on and explain this stuff to us?
Oh my god. And introducing the equivalence of mass and energy. It's plausible that Mileva helped in practical ways with this outpouring, like proofreading, library research, but there's no reliable evidence or verified proof to kind of show that. Some argued that Albert would have needed assistance with the maths for these, but actually the maths that's in these would not be a challenge for a student of his own qualifications. So those papers brought profound changes worldwide, and here's where he mentioned his friend Beso for valuable suggestions. So they travelled to Novi Sad to meet Mileva's family for the first time as well. So they meet her husband and her son for the first time together. And the University of Zurich gave Albert his doctoral degree. In 1907, he then began the habilitation, which is like a tenure in the University of Bern. And he had to write a specific paper to apply to that. And he started teaching as part-time as a private tutor. And the University of Geneva also gave him an honorary doctorate. So he's jet-setting again and having a great time and enjoying the fruit of all his work, which, he deserves to. But it's also a shit time for her, for Mileva. And it's also around this time he became a candidate for the Nobel Prize. Meanwhile, so he's kind of taking off in one direction. His trajectory is up and up. Mm-hmm. And Mileva's is just not, she's growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of emotional support and the isolation. They moved back to Zurich at one point, and she wrote to Helena, "I cannot tell you how happy we are because of this change, which will free Albert of his daily 8 hours in the office, and he'll be able to devote himself to his beloved science and only science." And there's a few letters with jabs like that. She says, "We are leaving Bern, where I have lived for 7 years now. Lived so many, I must say, bitter and hard days. I only hope and wish the fame does not have a harmful effect on his humanity." 1 month after arriving in Zurich, she realised she's pregnant and has a second son, Edward, which was a very difficult birth, and she was ill for weeks. The doctor diagnosed overwork, burnout, and recommended they get a live-in maid, which they couldn't afford. So instead, her mother ended up staying for a bit with them, So again, this must feel like, oh my God, my new role is to be a mother and wife, and I'm even just fucking failing at that.
Oh, yeah, that sounds so hard. Poor thing.
So she's writing to Helena, responding to Helena's previous letter. So she said, "You see, with this kind of fame, he does not have much time for his wife. I read between the lines of Helena's previous letter. A certain impish tone that I must be jealous of science. But what can I do? One gets the pearl, another the box," which is a kind of rough translation of a famous phrase, which is "to one the pearl, to the other the jewellery box." She said, "You see, I long for love, and I would so rejoice if I could hear an affirmative reply that I almost believe it is the fault of the damned science. So I gladly accept your smile on that account." At this time, Albert's surrounded by yes men and people telling him he's amazing. It's really unclear whether he was arsed, whether he was aware, whether this is what happens, this is what the life of a wife is, deal with it, I don't see a problem,
Yeah.
And he was just always chasing new teaching positions. He was just uprooting his family a lot. Yeah, they moved to Prague for a short time, during which they had electricity for the first time in their lives. But they hated it. I think both of them hated it. They just found everyone really snobby. There wasn't great amenities where they were living for children to play. They didn't like the water there, And Mileva recounts at this point as well, they met with another famous lecturer in Prague, and the three of them hung out for a bit, and it's when Mileva left was when the conversation turned to science. So at this point now, it's just this is my wife. She's no longer a scientist. She's no longer the intellectual aspect, which was the main aspect of their connection, is just dead,
Yeah, and she's completely cut off from that as part of her life.
Yeah, because I also thought this from the book, is that he was often going to conferences and stuff that would have interested her and that she would have been qualified to attend. And she did have one letter as well saying, like, she was sadly talking about how she'd have liked to have gone and listened to one of the conferences or talks he went to.
Yeah.
It's really sad. And it's just, I don't know, was it just once the boys arrived and she's already suffering from burnout? It was probably just inconceivable she would ever begin her studies again or do something, you know, take another thing on.
Yeah.
So the guy Weber, the dickhead guy, he died and Albert inherited his position. And so they're back in Zurich and started working on his general theory of relativity. The last surviving letter before a 4-year gap to Helena is in 1912. Mileva says they're very happy to have turned their backs on Prague. Big Albert is tirelessly working on his problems. One can say that he lives only for them. I must confess, with a bit of shame, that we are unimportant to him and take second place. We are living here happily and fairly quietly since my husband does not like interruptions to his work.
Wow. So she's being totally neglected at this point.
This is where I see a turn from whatever, neglect, just a bad marriage, whatever, to like, that sounds kind of abusive. And I know they touched on this in Evil Genius, the podcast Evil Genius. They do an episode on Einstein. And the argument for him being evil is shit father and husband.
Yeah, sounds kind of like that's true, to be fair.
It gets worse. Albert goes to stay in Berlin with his relatives because his mother moved to Berlin after his dad died. Renewed contact with a first cousin called Elsa Luvital, who, like, her maiden name was Einstein. And he hadn't seen her since she was a teenager. He's 36-year-old. No, she's 36. He's 33. She has 2 daughters and is a divorcee. And he fancies her.
Oh.
So she's the same age as Mileva, but she's not got a career. She's very content with domestic life, so a very different personality. He wrote to her in April 1912 declaring his love, but then in May 21 broke it off, and he said, I, like you, must carry my cross without hope.
Wow, dramatic much.
Yeah. And that year, the same year, not by coincidence, I'm sure, Mileva's mental health declined. She also had rheumatism at this point, so she's living with chronic illness, chronic pain. So she wasn't able to leave the house during the harsh winters in Zurich as much, and she wasn't able to go to the musical evenings and stuff that they were doing regularly with Albert's colleagues. A year later, in 1913, Albert started writing Elsa again, and they decided to meet. Albert says about meeting, quote, without my wife, who is unfortunately very jealous. Which is just like, you're even gaslighting yourself.
Wow, I mean, it's not like she didn't have a reason to be.
Yeah, that's not my jealous wife. That's like my dick behavior that she has a normal reaction to.
Yeah, it's like, no, you were fully cheating on her. Wow, I kind of hate this man a little bit.
He's a fucking asshole, you know what? So, in October 1913, they start hooking up. They spend a few days together. And then he gets a job in Berlin, which I'm sure is not a coincidence.
No, I'm sure.
So now when Mileva goes to visit him that Christmas, his mother, who hates her, and Elsa are there. But generally, Mileva and the boys stayed in Switzerland for a bit, because poor Edward has a long-term illness and is recovering in a spa. Edward also has some chronic health conditions.
Yeah.
So the marriage fully deteriorated in 1914 up in Berlin, and there was kind of friends got involved and mediated and gave Mileva a place to stay. And through these friends that were trying to help, Albert sent a list of conditions that were frankly completely abusive, that he's like, these are the only conditions under which you can live with me. And he said in his letter of those conditions that he submitted them at all only demonstrated his desire to not lose his children. You ready for these conditions, Jess?
I hate this man. Yeah, go on, hit me with it. Make me rage.
You're gonna hate him even more. Okay. A, you will make sure, 1, that my clothes and laundry are kept in good order. 2, that I will receive my 3 meals regularly in my bedroom. 3, that my bedroom and study is kept neat and especially that my desk is left for my use only. B. You will announce all personal relations with me, insofar as they are not completely necessary for social reasons. Specifically, you will forego 1. My sitting at home with you. 2. My going or out or travelling with you. C. You will obey the following points in your relations with me. 1. You will not expect any intimacy from me, nor will you reproach me in any way. 2. You will stop talking to me if I request it. 3. You will leave my bedroom or study immediately without protest if I request it. D. You will undertake not to belittle me in front of the children, either through words or behaviour.
Wow. I have no words. That is... That's abusive. That's the only word I can put on it. It is.
Yeah, I think that's the nail in the coffin for the case, that this was emotional abuse at the very least.
That is fully an abusive relationship. Yeah. Oh my God, this poor woman.
And that's what kind of caused the explosion in the first place. Was she came up to Berlin with the kids, and he had sequestered like practically an entire separate apartment for himself. So it's like they're already living in different countries most of the time, and then they visit, and then he's just like, obviously just wants to stay in his apartment the whole time and not see them, you know?
I hate him. I hate him so much.
Yeah, it's disgusting. And what's really sad is she agreed and returned to live with him, but as a temporary measure while they negotiated the separation agreement. So the separation agreement was Mileva and the boys would go to Switzerland. Albert would see the boys only outside his home, so in Switzerland, and without Elsa, he would support her and the boys financially. And there was an official signing arranged, but Albert didn't even show up to the official signing. He sent his friend Basil. And then Albert wrote to...
I hate him.
and then Albert wrote to Helena, like Mileva's only fucking friend and confidant at this stage left. He wrote to her explaining himself. What about me, poor man's?
I hate him so much.
Yeah, what a dick. So in 1916, he proposes divorce for the first time, and he's like, I've got these 6,000 Dutch marks in a savings account. You can have that as well as my continued financial support at this rate if you agree. And she refused, but at the time she was so sick. She had now had a heart ailment on top of her extreme anxiety. She was bedridden, and her poor kids, she ended up in a sanatorium. So her kids were first with a governess, and then Bezos's mother minded them for a bit, and then her friend Helena came and took them. So her boys were kind of shuttled between those 3 supports for a year. So Albert doesn't take any time to come down and help his boys while their mother is extremely ill. So in 1918, he requests divorce again, and she's like, yes. And they think he consulted like a financial advisor to come up with this idea, but he basically proposed, I'll give you all the money from the Nobel Prize if I win it, and I'll still pay you 9,000 marks a year. The Dutch mark at this point was collapsing because of the war. So it was just costing him a lot at this point. So then he's like, if I win the prize, I'll give all the money to you. The interest is yours to spend how you want, and the boys spend how you want, but the principal stays in security for the kids. The interest and a payment I give you will always add up to this amount a year. It was a nice offer. And, you know, at this point, Mileva's, I mean, listen to this for bad luck. It's like if I was writing this novel, I'd be like, I can't be this mean to this character. Mileva's sister at this point had a mental breakdown. Her brother was missing in action in the war in Russia, and Edward had ongoing health difficulties. So this was like a nice financial security. I know. Yeah. It's like... So 1919, it's all signed and finalised, and Albert had to make an open admission to adultery as the reason for divorce. He then won his Nobel Prize. Mileva requested permission to take out 145,000 Swiss franc from that to put down payment on apartments. So now her and the kids have somewhere to live, and they have an income from renting out the other apartments. Again, clever woman.
Yeah.
But again, and this is a sign to me again that this man is just an abusive asshole, is he just even violated the divorce agreement. He invested the money in a New York investment instead of a Swiss franc one. You know, then there was the 1920 crash in America. That for me is just classic emotional abuser. It's down to the last inch. If there's an agreement or a boundary, they'll fuck with it, you know?
Yeah.
So sadly, you know, this is a really tragic story. His son Edward had schizophrenia. Hans Albert became an engineer and a professor at the University of California, and his son became a physicist. Helena Koffler-Savage, Mileva's best friend, had a really sad ending. She remained in Belgrade throughout World War II, despite being half Jewish, and she ended up dying of starvation and pneumonia in 1944.
Oh, that's awful.
I know. I think that's a whole story on its own. I'd really like to know how that happened. Her own daughter became a medical doctor and professor as well. Mileva never remarried and died in Zurich in 1948, aged 72. So essentially, this is the very sad story of a woman with great promise and determination and courage. She was a pioneer for women in science at the turn of the century, but in the end, she didn't experience the success expected or deserved in her career, marriage, or life. Her tragedy is real, personal, and common. It's a story of equal intellectual soulmates, but somewhere along the way, life separated them as man and wife and scientists.
Yeah. Life separated them. I mean, yes, but also his abusive behavior.
I really feel like the book that was my main source for this episode didn't do that, didn't kind of emphasize that at all.
Yeah, and I think we should.
Evil Genius does, but my only problem with Evil Genius is I feel the episodes are too short. That's what they pride themselves on, is not going into the nuance too much, you know?
Yeah.
But I'm like, I always feel like more time can be offered to things like shitting on Albert and men who are just awful. House devils, street angels, you know?
Yeah. Wow, that's really sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is what we do. We tell these stories. Yeah, this was an interesting one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks.
If you're broke, you can support us by clicking follow, subscribe, liking and commenting on our episodes. And you can find us on most podcast hosting sites, and we're on YouTube if you would like subtitles.
Yes. And you can find us on all of the social medias. We are Women vs Everything on Facebook. We are Women vs Everything on Instagram, and we are WV Everything Pod on our very neglected Twitter account. You can also, if you have money, you could also give us money. Patreon.com/Women vs Everything, and the same handle on buymeacoffee.com as well. And we're just investing any money we make back into the podcast, into paying our wonderful editor, and generally just making this thing better.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're coming up to our 1 year birthday of this podcast, so watch this space for something exciting and
yes,
1 year birthday themed, I guess.
Yes, we released the first one sometime in February 2021. We need to check the exact date, but I think based on our release schedule at the moment, it might be after that by the time they hear this.
If you can hear this, this is the past and you've missed the party. Congratulations.
We are coming to you from the past. Do we want to do gratitude before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that's important because I'm a bit bummed out and sad. I've got a good gratitude thing. I got a new bunny.
Yes. What are they called, and do you have pictures?
Yes. You might have heard me ranting about my rabbit Theo that I've had since September. And he's a sweet baby angel and he's an asshole. So he's the reason I don't have a laptop at the moment, because he chewed the fucking cables and I'm struggling to replace them. Yeah, rabbits should not really be kept on their own unless you're at home all day long. The Sunday just passed. I've gotten a little baby called Lucky, another rescue. Her name is Lucky because she was found in a car park of a woods, abandoned. And she's a sweet baby angel for real. She does all these cute rabbit behaviors, like she licks me and she'll flop over onto her back, and she's really affectionate, and she's just confirmed that Theo is an asshole. And that his behavior is not normal rabbit behavior. He's just a dickhead. I'm going to be starting to bond them in about 2 weeks when she is settled. So I'll give you updates on that, on how they're getting on with their bonding process. They're going to go for little dates. They go for little dates in a cage, and you gradually make the cage bigger and bigger and bigger when you go like 3 days without seeing a negative behavior.
That's so cute. If awesome feminist history doesn't tempt you, then follow us on Instagram, because we will post pictures of the bunnies, right, Grace?
Absolutely. I'm Love in Disgrace on Instagram, and you can check Manny the Bunny videos on that.
Yes.
Fabulous. So yeah, super grateful for her and him. It's like, yeah, they're bringing such joy to my life, and I love them. Yeah. What about you, Jess?
I'm grateful for supportive friends. As I said at the beginning, it's been a bit of a time recently, but I've had some really lovely chats with some really awesome people. People have been checking in on me, and one of my wonderful friends sent me flowers, which are just next to me right now. And just everyone's been really sweet and really lovely, and I'm very lucky. So yeah, I'm grateful for supportive friends this week.
I would love us to meet in 2022 so I can give you a big hug.
Yes. This thing, please.
So, beloved listeners, thank you. We're both really grateful for you. Let us know what you think. If you spotted mistakes that are still in for editing, I think my timelines jumped around a little bit. If you spotted mistakes, we have a corrections corner. You know, if you think, and you probably do, know more about a topic than we do, come on our show as a guest. And if you also know of a badass woman from history that you'd like us to discuss, send suggestions our way. But in the meantime, do maths, physics, and geography, and love women.
See you next time, folks. Bye!
Bye! Don't be an abusive husband and love women. That's all I can think of.